What if the seat you paid for wasn't really yours? What if no matter how much money, status, or power you had, someone still looked at you and decided you didn't belong? On a routine flight from Los Angeles to New York, one simple decision changed everything. A flight attendant's judgment call, a young woman's refusal to be silenced, and a battle that shook an entire industry to its core. Buckle up, because this is more than just a story. This is a reckoning. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The VIP lounge at Los Angeles International Airport hummed with a quiet sort of luxury. Plush leather chairs, dim golden lighting, and the faint clinking of champagne glasses formed the backdrop of a space where time moved differently. Here, the wealthy and powerful lounged effortlessly, unbothered by the rush of the terminal outside. A soft classical tune played in the background, barely noticeable beneath the murmur of subdued conversations. Alora Benton sat in the farthest corner, near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the runway. Her posture was relaxed, but there was a quiet alertness in her eyes scanning the room, observing rather than participating. She wasn't dressed in designer labels like many around her, no flashy accessories, no signature handbags, just a fitted beige blazer over a simple white blouse, dark jeans, and sleek flats. If anything, her presence was understated, deliberately so. 17 years old and the daughter of Robert Benton, one of the most influential investors in American Global Airlines. Elora had grown up in a world of privilege, yet she had long learned that wealth did not guarantee respect, at least not for someone who looked like her. She sipped her tea, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of the porcelain cup as she listened to the conversations around her. Business deals, political gossip, murmurs of upcoming investments. It was the kind of talk she had been raised around, but not the kind she had ever fully felt part of. From across the lounge, a woman in a navy blue dress and pearls glanced at her, then leaned toward her companion. "She must have wandered in here by mistake," the woman murmured, her voice just low enough to be meant as subtle, but loud enough to be heard. Her companion, a silver-haired man in a tailored suit, barely glanced in Alora's direction before shrugging dismissively. Alora didn't flinch. She had heard variations of that phrase more times than she cared to count. Instead, she took another sip of her tea, allowing a small, knowing smile to tug at the corner of her lips. A lounge attendant approached. Unlike the effortless interactions with other guests, he hesitated for a fraction of a second before speaking. "Miss, may I see your boarding pass?" She looked up at him, her expression unreadable, then reached into her bag and handed over the slim black envelope holding her first-class ticket. The attendant examined it, flipping it over unnecessarily before nodding. "Thank you, Miss Benton. Enjoy your flight." She took the ticket back, not breaking eye contact. "I will." The attendant gave a quick, stiff smile before moving away. She could feel the woman in navy blue still watching her. It was always the same. The doubt, the assumptions, the moment of hesitation. Even here in a lounge meant for the elite, she was still expected to prove herself. Would they have questioned her if she looked different? Alora sighed, glancing at the departure screens. Her flight to New York would begin boarding soon. It wasn't the first time she had dealt with moments like these. But something about today felt different, heavier, as if it were leading to something bigger. With one final glance around the lounge, she stood up, collected her bag, and walked toward the gate. The first-class cabin was as pristine as expected. Large, spacious seats separated by sleek partitions, private monitors, and the soft scent of leather and fresh linen. As she stepped inside, a few passengers were already settled, some scrolling through their phones, others sipping champagne offered by the attendants. She maneuvered toward seat 1A, her assigned place. Just as she placed her bag down, a shadow loomed beside her. "Excuse me, sweetheart," a voice interrupted, light but carrying an unmistakable edge. Elora turned. A flight attendant stood before her, wearing a crisp navy uniform. Her blonde hair was pulled into a tight bun, her posture rigid, professional. The name tag on her lapel read Sharon Whitmore. "You might have the wrong seat," Sharon said with a polite but pointed smile. "The economy section is just a few rows back." Alora held her gaze, expression unreadable. Then, without a word, she reached into her bag and pulled out her ticket. Sharon hesitated for a moment before accepting it, glancing at the details. The faintest flicker of confusion crossed her features before her expression smoothed back into practiced neutrality. Alora didn't look away. She had been here before, too many times. This wasn't a mistake. This was a test, and she was ready. Sharon Whitmore had worked for American Global Airlines for over 2 decades. In that time, she had learned to read people within seconds. The true first-class passengers, the ones who belonged, carried themselves with a certain ease. They knew the unspoken rules, the expectations, the air of quiet entitlement that came with luxury. Then there were the others, the ones who didn't quite fit, the ones who, for whatever reason, always felt slightly out of place. And to Sharon, the girl standing before her in seat 1A was one of those people. She studied Alora with a critical eye, her smile never faltering. "Are you sure you're in the right seat, sweetheart?" she asked again, a touch slower this time, as if speaking to a child who had wandered where they shouldn't. Alora didn't blink. She simply tilted her head slightly, as if trying to decide how much energy this conversation was worth. "Yes," she replied evenly, her voice calm but firm. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Sharon's smile tightened. "Well," she said, "let's just double-check that." She glanced down at the boarding pass in her hand, an action that should have taken only a second but stretched into an unnecessary pause as she scrutinized the details. Seat 1A, first class, passenger, Alora Benton. The information was all there, clear, undeniable, but still. She flipped the ticket over, checking the back, as if expecting some hidden message to appear. A few passengers nearby had begun to take notice. A businessman in a gray suit flicked his eyes up from his phone. A woman across the aisle shifted in her seat, curiosity lighting her gaze. Sharon ignored them. "This ticket," she started, then hesitated, before settling on a different approach. "Who purchased it for you?" Alora's fingers curled slightly around the handle of her carry-on. "I did," she answered, her voice smooth. Sharon's brows lifted just enough to make her disbelief clear. "Oh," she said lightly. "I see." She turned slightly and motioned toward a younger male attendant standing nearby. "Connor, would you mind verifying this?" The young man blinked, looking caught off guard. He hesitated, then took the ticket from Sharon's hand and examined it for himself. A brief moment passed before he cleared his throat. "It's valid," he said simply, glancing at Alora before handing the pass back. Sharon's jaw tightened. Alora met her gaze steadily. "If there's a problem," she said, "maybe you should call your supervisor." A flicker of irritation crossed Sharon's face. "I don't think that will be necessary," she said, her tone crisp. But something in her demeanor had shifted. She had lost the upper hand. Before she could say anything else, another voice entered the conversation. "She already showed her ticket," a man said from a few rows back. "What exactly are you looking for?" Sharon turned sharply. Ethan Kessler sat comfortably in seat 2B, his sharp blue eyes watching the situation unfold with mild interest. In his early 30s, dressed in a tailored navy blazer, he had the relaxed confidence of someone who had spent years navigating corporate America. Sharon's smile returned, but it was thinner now. "Oh, no problem at all," she said quickly. "Just making sure everything is in order." Ethan arched an eyebrow. "Well, seems like it is," he said. The cabin had gone quiet now, subtle but unmistakable. People were listening, watching. Sharon inhaled through her nose, then let out a small, breathy laugh as she looked back at Alora. "Of course," she said. "Just a mix-up." She turned slightly to leave, then hesitated. With practiced ease, she leaned in just a fraction and lowered her voice. "You know," she murmured, "it would have been easier if you had just spoken up right away." Alora didn't react. She simply reached for her seatbelt. Sharon's lips curled into something that was neither a smile nor a frown. Then, just as she was about to step away, something in her posture changed. A decision had been made. She turned back. "I think we should get a second opinion," she said. And before Alora could reply, Sharon reached for the intercom. "We need security at the first-class cabin," she said smoothly. "There seems to be an issue with a passenger's seating arrangement." A ripple of movement passed through the cabin. A few passengers exchanged looks. Others pretended not to notice but shifted in their seats. Elora exhaled slowly through her nose. This was happening. The security officer arrived within minutes. A tall man in a neatly pressed uniform, his face unreadable as he approached. Sharon stepped forward before he could speak. "This young lady might have been seated incorrectly," she explained, her voice still carrying that polite, well-practiced professionalism. The officer nodded once and turned to Elora. "Miss, can I see your ticket, please?" Wordlessly, she handed it over. He glanced at it, then back at Sharon, his expression neutral. "It's valid," he said. Sharon barely missed a beat. "Well, just to be sure, why don't we have her wait in the economy section while we verify everything?" Elora didn't move. The officer looked at her. "Miss, I'm going to need you to come with me to the main cabin for now." For a brief second, no one spoke. Elora felt it then, the weight of every pair of eyes in the room, some filled with curiosity, others with discomfort. But not one voice, not one passenger spoke up, except for one. "This is ridiculous," Ethan muttered under his breath. But it didn't matter. The decision had been made. Elora slowly rose to her feet. She didn't argue, didn't resist. She simply adjusted the strap of her bag, smoothed the front of her blazer, and walked past Sharon without a second glance. Sharon didn't move out of the way at first. Then just as Elora passed her, she smiled. It was subtle, but it was there. The economy section was crowded, far more chaotic than the quiet luxury of first class. Babies cried, flight attendants maneuvered through the aisles with hurried efficiency, and the hum of dozens of conversations filled the air. Elora lowered herself into a window seat near the middle of the cabin, exhaling as she settled in. She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and opened her messages. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before typing. One sentence. Short. Simple. She pressed send. Far away across the country, Robert Benton's phone vibrated. The message appeared on his screen. "They did exactly what I expected. Handle it." Elora locked her phone and tucked it away. She glanced out the window, her expression unreadable. Meanwhile, back in first class, Sharon Whitmore took her time adjusting a tray, an easy smile playing on her lips. She had no idea what was coming. The air in the economy cabin felt different. It was heavier, filled with the kind of noise and motion that never quite settled. A baby wailed somewhere in the background, its cries blending into the muffled conversations and occasional beeps from call buttons pressed by impatient passengers. The aisle was a constant stream of movement. Flight attendants navigating the narrow walkway, passengers shifting in their seats, arms stretching into the limited space. Elora sat by the window, her body angled slightly away from the man beside her, who had already dozed off, his shoulder dangerously close to invading her space. In front of her, a young mother rocked a fussy toddler back and forth, murmuring gentle reassurances. The seat was firm, the armrests too close together, the tray table slightly wobbly. Everything about it felt like a world apart from the plush, spacious comfort she had paid for. She exhaled slowly, pressing her fingers against the cool window pane. Outside, the vast expanse of clouds stretched endlessly, indifferent to whatever was unfolding inside the plane. The unfairness of it all clawed at her. Not just the loss of a seat, but the quiet, unspoken message behind it, one she had heard in different ways her whole life. She had been made to feel out of place before. At galas where guests subtly questioned her presence, assuming she was a plus one rather than someone who belonged. At charity luncheons where donors looked past her, directing their conversation to whoever they thought held the real power. Even in classrooms where teachers hesitated before calling on her, as if unsure whether she truly deserved her spot in the advanced courses. And now, here, doubt didn't just come in words. It lived in glances, in hesitation, in the way people second-guessed her presence before she even spoke. She had thought she had learned to live with it, to expect it, but it still burned. Her father had always told her to ignore it, to keep her head high, let the weight of her last name do the talking. But was that really enough? Would there ever be a day when she didn't have to prove herself before she was acknowledged? Her fingers tightened into a fist on her lap. Even with all the privilege in the world, she still wasn't enough for people like Sharon Whitmore. Nearly 3,000 miles away, in a sleek office overlooking the New York skyline, Robert Benton sat at his desk, reviewing reports when his phone vibrated beside him. One message. Short, simple. They did exactly what I expected. Handle it. For a moment, he didn't move. Then slowly, he leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing as he reread the words. There was no anger in his expression, no sharp intake of breath or display of frustration, but the shift in the air was unmistakable. His assistant, standing nearby with a tablet in hand, recognized that shift instantly. Sir? Robert didn't reply immediately. Instead, he picked up his phone, scrolled to his contacts, and pressed a name. The line rang once before connecting. Mark, Robert said smoothly, his voice low but commanding. There's a situation on Flight 486. Fix it. The person on the other end, Mark Peterson, CEO of American Global Airlines, paused for half a second too long. I, I'll look into it immediately, Mr. Benton. No, Robert corrected. You'll resolve it immediately. And while you're at it, make sure everyone involved understands just how big of a mistake they've made. Mark swallowed. Of course, I'll make some calls right now. You do that, Robert replied, then ended the call. His expression never changed, but the energy in the room did. His assistant shifted slightly. Shall I notify legal? Not yet, Robert said, setting the phone down. But tell them to be ready. 35,000 feet above the ground, the message had already traveled down the chain of command. In the cockpit, Captain Mark Holloway received a direct call from headquarters, his brow furrowing as he listened. When the voice on the other end finished speaking, he nodded once, his grip tightening on the edge of his seat. Understood, he said. I'll handle it. Hanging up, he turned toward his co-pilot before reaching for the intercom. Get me the lead flight attendant, he instructed. A few minutes later, Sharon Whitmore appeared at the entrance of the cockpit, her expression neutral, professional. You needed me, Captain. Mark Holloway had been in the aviation industry for over 2 decades. He had seen his fair share of mistakes, some small, some catastrophic. And if there was one thing he had learned, it was that problems like these didn't come to his attention unless someone had screwed up badly. He leveled her with a steady look. Did you remove a passenger from first class? Sharon lifted her chin. There was a misunderstanding. A young lady, she was in C-1A, but did you verify her credentials before moving her? Sharon hesitated just for a second. I had concerns about the legitimacy of the seating arrangement. That's not what I asked. Her hands clasped behind her back. No, Captain. But she didn't what? Mark pressed, his voice cool. Didn't look like she belonged there? The silence that followed was suffocating. Mark exhaled sharply through his nose, then leaned forward. Let me be very clear about what's happening right now, he said. That passenger is Alora Benton, as in Robert Benton's daughter, as in one of the biggest shareholders of this airline. And you just forcibly moved her to economy without cause. Sharon's skin lost its color. The weight of the name, Benton, hit her like a slap. She parted her lips, scrambling for words, for an excuse, for anything that could justify what she had done. But nothing came, because deep down, she knew. This had never been about protocol, never been about a mistake. She had made a choice, and now she was about to pay for it. Mark Holloway didn't give her time to recover. Here's what's going to happen next, he continued, his voice like steel. You're going to fix this, right now, and when we land, you're going to have a conversation with corporate about whether you belong in that uniform. Sharon swallowed hard, her throat dry. Yes, Captain, she said, barely above a whisper. But as she turned and walked away, her mind raced. Fix this? How? The hum of the airplane engines had once been a soothing backdrop, but now in the first-class cabin, it carried an undercurrent of tension. Conversations were quieter, stolen glances more frequent. Something had shifted, and even those who hadn't witnessed what had happened earlier could sense that something was wrong. The flight attendants moved with an air of unease, their usual confidence slightly shaken. A whispered exchange near the galley caught the attention of Ethan Kessler, who had been observing everything from his seat. He leaned slightly toward the nearest attendant, a younger woman with wide eyes and a nervous energy about her. What's going on? He asked, keeping his voice low. She doesn't seem like just any passenger. The woman hesitated, glancing around before leaning in. She's Robert Benton's daughter, she whispered, as if saying the name out loud would cause an even bigger ripple through the cabin. Ethan straightened, processing the information. He wasn't easily shocked, but this was big. Robert Benton wasn't just a wealthy man. He was the Robert Benton, a titan in the business world, someone whose influence extended far beyond investments. If his daughter had been humiliated on this flight, the consequences wouldn't be minor. Ethan ran a hand down his face, exhaling. He had suspected something was off when the flight attendant had pressed Alora about her ticket. But now, this was a disaster waiting to unfold. Meanwhile, the whispers continued among the crew. The tension wasn't just among the passengers anymore. It had spread to the staff. No one wanted to be the one responsible for this mistake, but there was no denying who had started it, and she was about to face the consequences. In the cockpit, Captain Mark Holloway sat behind his controls, but his focus wasn't on the flight path. Across from him, Sharon Whitmore stood stiffly, hands clasped in front of her, back straight. If it weren't for the slight twitch in her fingers, she would have looked perfectly composed. I was following protocol, she insisted, her voice controlled but tight. There was a potential security concern, and I acted accordingly. Mark Holloway stared at her for a long moment, then exhaled sharply through his nose. Let's not waste time here, he said. You didn't question anyone else's credentials. You didn't verify any of the other passengers sitting in first class. You specifically targeted her. Sharon's jaw clenched. I had a reason to believe you had nothing but your own judgment, which in this case was completely wrong. Mark interrupted. Do you have any idea what kind of situation you've put us in? Sharon said nothing. He continued. She's not just any passenger. She is the daughter of one of the most powerful men in this country. And you, he let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head, decided to kick her out of first class because, what, she didn't look like she belonged? Sharon's face twitched. No one told me who she was. Mark's eyes flashed with something sharp. And that's exactly the problem. She pressed her lips together, but he could see it, the slow realization creeping in. There's no fixing this, he went on, not entirely. But here's what you will do. You're going to go down there and apologize. Right now. The words sat between them like a heavy weight. Sharon inhaled through her nose, her fingers pressing against her palms. Understood, she said finally, her voice tight. But as she turned and walked away, she could feel something unraveling beneath her feet. The moment Sharon stepped into the economy section, the noise and movement felt suffocating. She hadn't spent much time in this part of the plane, certainly not during a flight. But now, as she walked down the narrow aisle, every passing glance felt heavier than usual. When she finally reached Alora's row, she paused, clearing her throat. Alora didn't look up at first. She was sitting calmly, hands resting on her lap, her gaze fixed on the window as if the world beyond it was far more interesting than the scene unfolding beside her. Sharon exhaled, then spoke, keeping her tone even. I'd like to apologize for the misunderstanding earlier, she said. You're welcome to return to your original seat in first class. Alora finally turned. Her gaze locked onto Sharon's, and for a moment, nothing else existed. Sharon expected anger, maybe indignation. She had dealt with upset passengers before. She knew what to expect. But what she saw in Alora's expression wasn't rage. It was something much colder, a quiet, controlled refusal to be placated. The silence stretched. Then finally Alora spoke. No, Sharon blinked. Excuse me? I said no, Alora repeated. I'll stay here. The air between them grew heavier. Sharon's fingers twitched, her carefully crafted apology thrown off course. Alora didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The meaning was clear. She wasn't going to make this easy. She wasn't going to let Sharon walk away, thinking a forced apology could erase what had happened. Sharon opened her mouth, then closed it. She knew better than to argue. Without another word, she turned and left. Back in first class, Sharon returned to her post, moving stiffly, her jaw tight. But before she could fully collect herself, something else caught her attention. A murmur, a few passengers shifting uncomfortably, and then someone's phone screen. bright against the dim lights of the cabin. At first, it was just a few words, a headline. She couldn't see the full article, but she didn't need to. Her stomach dropped. Across the country, on news sites, social media, in discussion forums, the story had begun to spread. Black passenger forced out of first class on AGA Airlines. Company faces backlash. Sharon's breath caught. Elora hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't caused a scene. She hadn't needed to, because the damage was already done. Sharon understood. She hadn't just made a mistake. She had ignited something much bigger than herself. The plane glided smoothly over the Midwest, its engines humming against the vast open sky. Inside, however, there was nothing smooth about the atmosphere. The tension in the cabin had shifted from quiet curiosity to something heavier, something unmistakable. Passengers whispered in hushed tones, their faces illuminated by the glow of their phone screens. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the first-class section, where a few people began glancing toward the economy cabin as if trying to catch a glimpse of Elora Benton, the girl who had unknowingly ignited a scandal at 35,000 feet. Ethan Kessler scrolled through his phone, frowning as he read the rapidly multiplying headlines. AGA Airlines under fire for racial discrimination on Flight 1486. Daughter of billionaire investor allegedly removed from first class based on appearance. Outrage grows as airline faces accusations of bias. Every major news outlet was picking it up. Twitter was on fire. Instagram stories filled with screenshots of the controversy, and hashtags like Boycott AGA and Justice for Elora had already begun trending. He glanced toward the front of the cabin, where the flight attendants moved stiffly, their usual air of effortless service now replaced with barely concealed anxiety. The realization sank in. This was no longer just an incident. This was a full-blown crisis. In the crew's private cabin, Sharon Whitmore sat frozen, her fingers clutching her phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She had spent over 20 years in this job, and never had she been at the center of something like this. She forced herself to read the words on the screen again, but they didn't change. AGA Airlines accused of racial discrimination mid-flight. Passenger forcibly moved from first class despite valid ticket. Airline responds with silence. A cold sweat broke out along the back of her neck. She had thought she was in control when she made that call earlier. She had thought she was handling a situation the way she always had. But now her name was being dragged into something much bigger than herself. She scrolled further and saw something that made her breath hitch. A video. Someone had recorded the entire thing. From the moment she questioned Elora's ticket to the exact second security had escorted her out of first class. The clip was already going viral, with people dissecting her words, her tone, her expression. The comments underneath made her stomach drop. She didn't even try to hide it. Look at the way she talks down to her. Classic. How many times has this happened to people who aren't billionaires' kids? Sharon clenched her jaw. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, Robert Benton sat behind his desk in his Manhattan office, his expression unreadable as he listened to the panicked voice of Mark Peterson, CEO of American Global Airlines. "Robert, I assure you, we're handling the situation," Mark stammered. I just got off a call with our PR team. We're drafting a statement as we speak. Robert's voice cut through the nervous rambling. "No, Mark, you're not handling it. If you were, I wouldn't be reading about it on the front page of every major news outlet before I even got a call from your team." Silence. Robert leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the sleek wooden surface of his desk. "She is my daughter," he continued, his voice quiet but carrying the kind of weight that made men like Mark Peterson sweat. "And your airline just made the single worst mistake it could have possibly made." Mark inhaled sharply. "We'll issue an apology." "An apology?" Robert repeated, his voice dropping into something dangerously smooth. "You think a neatly crafted press statement is going to fix this?" Mark swallowed. "If this isn't resolved before that plane lands," Robert continued, "then by the time Elora walks off that aircraft, your stock price will be in free fall. And if that happens, Mark, I will personally make sure that you're the one answering to every single investor in the boardroom." Mark's throat bobbed. I, I understand. We'll act immediately. See that you do. The call ended. Robert set his phone down and exhaled slowly. His mind was already working through the next steps, already anticipating what needed to happen next. Because this wasn't just a personal insult. This was business. And in business, someone always paid. Back on Flight 1486, the tension among the crew was reaching a breaking point. In the flight attendants' meeting area, Captain Mark Holloway stood with his arms crossed, his face carved into stone. Around him, the lead attendants, including Sharon, stood at rigid attention. "We need to control this situation before we land," Holloway said, his voice measured but firm. "The airline is already in full damage control, which means we don't have the luxury of letting this escalate any further." Sharon kept her expression neutral, but inside her pulse was pounding. "I was only following protocol," she said again, her voice edged with the remnants of her earlier confidence. "No one informed me who she was." "You keep saying that," a younger attendant, Jenna Lopez, interjected, frustration creeping into her tone. "But did you ever ask? Did you even consider that you might be wrong before kicking her out of her seat?" Sharon's lips pressed into a thin line. "This isn't about protocol anymore," Captain Holloway said. "This is about damage control. The airline cannot afford this kind of scandal, and right now, you are the center of it." He took a breath, then gave the order. "Effective immediately, you are relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight, and once we land, corporate will be making a decision about your future with this company." Sharon's stomach turned to lead. Her future. The word struck her like a physical blow. No, this wasn't supposed to happen. She had been with AGA Airlines for years. She had seen other attendants make real mistakes, mistakes that put passengers in actual danger, and they had been given second chances. This wasn't supposed to cost her everything. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice tight. "I was just doing my job." "The mistake," Holloway cut in, "was thinking that you wouldn't have to answer for it." Silence fell over the room. Then slowly, Sharon exhaled. The reality of the situation settled over her. She had lost control of this narrative. And the worst part? She didn't know how to get it back. The steady hum of the engines was the only thing that remained unchanged. Everything else, every glance, every whispered conversation, every stiff interaction among the crew, had taken on a new weight. The plane was now just 45 minutes from New York, but the tension had settled like a storm cloud over the entire flight. A new headline popped up on Ethan Kessler's phone screen. AGA Airlines releases official statement amid growing backlash. He clicked on it, scanning the vague, rehearsed words. "We are aware of the concerns regarding an incident on Flight 1486 and are currently conducting an internal review. AGA Airlines is committed to providing equal and fair treatment to all passengers. We take this matter seriously and will take appropriate action if necessary." Ethan scoffed under his breath. It was the kind of statement big corporations threw out when they were desperate to control the damage, but didn't want to admit fault. It didn't work. As soon as the press release went live, the internet erupted again. Translation: they're panicking. AGA Airlines just said a whole lot of nothing. Internal review. We all saw the video. What exactly is there to investigate? The public wasn't buying it. The company had underestimated just how fast this situation had spiraled. Ethan glanced toward the front of the plane, where the flight attendants moved in hurried, hushed tones. If he had to guess, they knew this was only going to get worse. Inside the crew's private cabin, Sharon Whitmore sat with her phone pressed against her ear, her pulse drumming in her temples. She had spent years building her reputation, years maintaining her image as a professional, experienced flight attendant. She wasn't about to let all of that crumble in a matter of hours. Her contact in the media answered on the second ring. "Sharon?" The voice was sharp, expectant. "I was just about to call you. What the hell is going on?" Sharon closed her eyes briefly, choosing her words carefully. "It's not what they're making it out to be," she said, keeping her voice low. "The passenger in question, she was difficult from the start. She refused to cooperate, was acting suspicious. I was just following standard procedure." A brief pause. You're telling me she wasn't removed just because of how she looked? Sharon inhaled. I'm saying there was more to it than that, but the media has already twisted the story into something it wasn't. Her contact exhaled on the other end. I can try to push back on the narrative, but I need something solid. Do you have any kind of documentation? Any internal reports? Sharon hesitated. Not yet, she admitted, but I can get something. Another pause, then, I'll see what I can do, the voice said. But you need to prepare yourself, Sharon. If this goes bad, the airline will throw you under the bus first. Sharon's grip tightened on the phone. She knew that, and she had no intention of letting it happen. Meanwhile, Alora Benton sat quietly in her economy seat, untouched by the chaos brewing around her. She hadn't touched her phone since sending that message to her father. She hadn't scrolled through social media, hadn't made any public statements, because she understood something most people didn't. This wasn't just about her. This wasn't about a rich girl who had been treated unfairly on a flight. This was about everyone who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or assumed to be less than. If she spoke out now, it would become about her. And that wasn't the point. So she let the internet do the talking for her. She watched the clouds drift past the window, her hands resting in her lap, her expression unreadable. She wasn't angry anymore. She was waiting. The final descent into JFK was announced over the intercom. On the ground, the situation had escalated beyond anyone's control. A crowd had already formed at the arrival gates. Journalists, photographers, news crews. The story had reached television networks, and now people wanted a statement. But it wasn't just the media. A group of activists had gathered as well, holding signs with phrases like, "Dignity, not discrimination," and "We belong everywhere." AGA Airlines had sent a PR representative to the airport, but they were already overwhelmed. The press was demanding answers, shareholders were calling for emergency meetings, and social media was amplifying every new development by the second. Back on the plane, Sharon Whitmore's breath hitched as she glanced out the window and saw the flashing lights of news cameras. She had known there would be fallout. She hadn't expected this. The realization hit her like ice through her veins. If the airline was forced to make a sacrifice, it was going to be her. She had just enough time to register the dread settling in her stomach before the seatbelt sign dinged off and the slow shuffle of passengers preparing to deplane began. The cabin door opened and Alora Benton stepped off the plane. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then, the cameras flashed. The reporters surged forward, microphones stretched toward her, voices overlapping as they shouted questions. Alora didn't flinch. She didn't say a word, because she didn't need to. She simply walked forward, her stride even, her expression calm. And waiting for her, standing just beyond the crowd, was Robert Benton, tall, unshaken. His gaze locked onto his daughter, and in that moment, without a single word exchanged, an entire conversation passed between them. She had done her part. Now it was his turn, and as Sharon Whitmore finally stepped off the plane, her face drained of color as she took in the chaos waiting outside, one thing became clear. She wasn't just facing the public's outrage. She was about to face Robert Benton himself. And the real battle was just beginning. The moment the cabin doors swung open, the noise from outside flooded the aircraft. It wasn't just the typical airport bustle, the distant hum of luggage carts, the clipped voices of flight attendants directing passengers. This was something else, something bigger. A mass of people had gathered beyond the jet bridge. Camera flashes flickered in rapid bursts, illuminating the waiting area like a chaotic storm of artificial light. Reporters with microphones pushed against the barriers, calling out questions to anyone who looked important enough to answer. Alora Benton stepped forward, the weight of 100 lenses zooming in on her every movement. But she didn't rush. She didn't cower. She simply walked. Her father was already there, standing just past security, flanked by a team of lawyers in dark suits. Robert Benton was a man who commanded attention effortlessly, not through volume, but through presence. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with an authority that left no room for doubt. As soon as Alora reached him, he placed a firm hand on her shoulder, a silent reassurance, a quiet declaration of support. Then, without hesitation, he turned to face the cameras. The press conference was arranged within minutes. The reporters didn't even need an official announcement. They followed Benton instinctively, knowing that whatever came next would dictate the story. Microphones were set up hastily, wires snaking across the polished airport floor. The crowd grew, passengers pausing to watch, employees stealing glances between shifts. Robert Benton stepped in front of the podium, adjusting the microphone. The room hushed. Then he spoke. "This is not just about my daughter," he said, his voice calm, measured, but carrying the force of a gavel striking wood. "This is about something much larger. This is about the systemic way in which certain individuals are treated, about the assumptions that are made based on nothing but perception." He let that sink in. Alora Benton purchased a first-class ticket. She did everything a paying customer is expected to do. And yet she was still questioned, still removed from her seat, still treated as though she didn't belong. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "This," he continued, "is not just about one mistake. It is a reflection of a much bigger problem, one that American global airlines must be held accountable for." He turned his gaze directly to the cameras. They must answer for what happened today. For a moment, no one moved. No one even breathed. Then, chaos. Every reporter in the room erupted at once, shouting questions over each other, desperate to get a comment. But Benton had said what he needed to say, and the message had been received loud and clear. Inside the headquarters of AGA Airlines, panic had already set in. Mark Peterson, the company's CEO, sat in his corner office, gripping his phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. Outside his glass walls, executives and PR representatives scrambled, typing furiously, answering calls, debating damage control strategies. The airline's official statement, released just an hour ago, had done nothing to ease the storm. "We are aware of the concerns regarding an incident on Flight 1486 and are currently conducting an internal review. AGA Airlines is committed to providing equal and fair treatment to all passengers. We take this matter seriously and will take appropriate action if necessary." It had been vague on purpose, non-committal, a classic corporate move, but the public wasn't buying it. Mark scrolled through Twitter, his stomach twisting at the backlash. AGA Airlines thinks we're stupid. They really thought internal review would make this go away? Justice for Alora. Boycott this airline. Every second, the situation was slipping further from his grasp. His phone buzzed again. Another call. Another investor demanding an explanation. Mark exhaled sharply. This was bad. Very, very bad. Meanwhile, Sharon Whitmore had never moved through an airport so quickly in her life. She kept her head down, gripping the handle of her rolling suitcase, weaving through the crowd as discreetly as possible. But it didn't matter. She barely made it past baggage claim before she was spotted. "Ms. Whitmore." A voice rang out, sharp, urgent. She turned just in time to see a reporter striding toward her, camera crew in tow. Sharon's stomach dropped. "Ms. Whitmore, can you comment on the allegations against you?" The reporter pressed, microphone already extended toward her. Sharon tried to walk faster. "Do you believe your actions were justified?" No response. "Do you regret what happened?" She clenched her jaw, keeping her gaze forward. "But then, do you believe you were unfairly targeted by this controversy?" That made her pause, because she saw an opening. She turned slightly, just enough for the camera to catch her face. "There's a lot of misinformation going around," she said carefully. "People are making judgments without knowing the full story." The reporter leaned in. "So you believe this has been exaggerated?" Sharon nodded, schooling her expression into something composed. "I was following protocol," she said. "I treated the situation as I would with any other passenger. The airline has rules for a reason." It was a gamble, a desperate attempt to shift the narrative before she lost complete control. But it was too late. Because even as she spoke, another notification popped up on a phone screen just a few feet away. A formal legal notice from Benton's legal team. AGA Airlines was officially being sued. The internet exploded. Headlines spread like wildfire. Robert Benton takes legal action against AGA Airlines after alleged racial profiling incident. Lawsuit filed following viral video of passengers' removal from first class. Justice for Allura trends as public outcry intensifies. The conversation had officially left the realm of airline policy disputes. Now it was something else entirely, a reckoning, and there was no going back. Sharon Whitmore saw the news alert as she finally reached her car. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just backlash anymore. This was the end. Her hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel. She had spent decades in this industry, climbed her way up, learned the rules, played the game, and now with one bad decision, it was all slipping away. She could already see it. The meetings, the disciplinary hearings, the termination papers. Because AGA Airlines would need someone to blame, and she knew exactly who it would be. The morning after the incident, Allura Benton sat in her father's office, staring at the computer screen. The world had made her the center of a conversation she hadn't asked to lead. Every major news outlet was dissecting the story. Every social media platform flooded with opinions, some in support, some filled with skepticism. Her name was trending across every platform. Some voices were loud with outrage. Finally, someone with power is calling this out. How many times has this happened to people who didn't have a billionaire father to fight for them? Others were sharp with resentment. She's just another rich kid playing the victim. This isn't about justice. It's about making a scene. And then there were those who dismissed it entirely. Are we really surprised? This is how the world works. Nothing's going to change. Allura exhaled, rubbing her temple. The weight of it all settled on her shoulders in a way she hadn't fully anticipated. This was bigger than her now. She had spent years trying to prove she was more than just Robert Benton's daughter. She had wanted to carve her own path, make her own name without being defined by the wealth and influence that followed her. But now that privilege, the very thing she had spent so long trying to downplay, was the only reason this story wasn't being ignored. She understood the magnitude of what she could do with it. She didn't just have an opportunity, she had a responsibility. Robert Benton sat across from her, his fingers steepled together, watching her closely. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice even. "You can walk away right now and I will handle this." Allura looked up. "You mean you'll destroy them?" she said flatly. His silence was his answer. She knew how her father operated. If she stepped aside, he would tear AGA Airlines apart, dismantling them piece by piece until there was nothing left but a cautionary tale for other corporations. And he wouldn't do it for justice. He would do it because they had disrespected a Benton. "I don't want this to just be about me," she said, sitting back. "I don't want to be another rich girl crying about an inconvenience. This happens to people who don't have lawyers on speed dial, and no one ever talks about it." Robert studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. "Then what do you want?" Allura took a breath. "I want people to listen," she said, "and not because of our last name." Her father leaned forward, tapping a single finger against his desk. "There is a cost to this," he said. "You know that, don't you?" She swallowed but didn't break eye contact. "I do. If you speak up, people will pick you apart. They will twist your words, question your motives. They'll say you're making a spectacle, looking for attention. They will find ways to turn this against you." Allura nodded. "They already are." Robert exhaled through his nose, his gaze sharp. "Then why do it?" Her fingers tightened around the armrest of the chair. "Because someone has to," she said simply. Robert's expression shifted, just slightly. There was something almost like pride in his eyes. Then he reached for his phone. "Then let's make sure they listen," he said. 48 hours. That's all it took for Allura Benton to go from a passenger on a plane to the face of a national conversation. Her exclusive interview was announced within hours of her decision, set to air live on one of the country's biggest networks. Every news outlet picked up the story. Every headline buzzed with speculation. The world was waiting to hear what she had to say, and she was ready. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit apartment across town, Sharon Whitmore sat with her own phone pressed against her ear, listening as a voice on the other end laid out her options. "The company needs you to make a statement," the lawyer from AGA Airlines said. Sharon's pulse pounded in her ears. "They think if you clarify your side of the story," the lawyer continued, "it might help contain the situation." Sharon scoffed, gripping the phone tighter. "You mean they need a scapegoat?" There was a pause. "We're trying to protect everyone's best interests," Her laugh was bitter. You mean the company's best interests? Sharon wasn't naive. She knew exactly what this was. AGA Airlines was in damage control mode, and they needed someone to absorb the hit. She could see the path unfolding in front of her. If she took the blame, the airline might offer her a quiet settlement, a severance package, something to make her go away. If she refused, they would throw her under the bus anyway, just with less dignity. Neither option saved her career. But there was a third option. She could fight back. If she did, she wouldn't be alone. There were people, powerful people, who would see an opportunity in her situation. If she played this right, she could turn herself from the villain in this story to the victim of corporate abandonment. But was she willing to do that? Her hand trembled slightly as she ran a finger along the edge of her coffee table. Give me time to think, she said. You don't have much, the lawyer warned. I know, she hung up. She wasn't just scared, she was angry. She had built her life around this career. She had earned her position. And now, because of one moment, one decision, she was being discarded like she had never mattered. Sharon sat back, staring at the ceiling. She had always been the one making the calls. Now someone else was holding the cards. And she hated it. She hated it enough to do something about it. The country was watching. In just a few minutes, Alora Benton would step onto the set of ABC News for her first televised interview. The network had been promoting it nonstop, calling it the moment America has been waiting for. She wasn't a celebrity. She wasn't a politician. But somehow she had become the story. Hours earlier, in the sleek offices of Benton Holdings, Robert Benton sat across from his daughter, an unreadable expression on his face. In front of them, an envelope lay unopened on the polished mahogany desk. It had arrived that morning, hand-delivered by a legal representative from AGA Airlines. A settlement offer, a way for this whole thing to quietly go away. 7 figures, tax-free, a non-disclosure agreement. Alora stared at it. All you have to do, Robert said, voice even, is sign. He had no intention of letting her accept it, but he wanted to see what she would do. Alora ran a finger along the edge of the envelope. She knew what this was, a buyout of silence. She could take the money and walk away. Let the airlines spin whatever narrative they wanted. She could go back to her life, her safe, comfortable life. But that wasn't the choice she was struggling with. The real choice was whether she had the strength to stand in the fire that was coming. She thought about the thousands of people who had messaged her, people who had been kicked out of places they belonged, who had been made to feel like outsiders in spaces they had earned. People who didn't have the privilege of cameras and lawyers and billion-dollar last names. She thought about Sharon Whitmore on that plane, the way she had looked at her, not with hesitation, not with doubt, but with certainty. Certainty that she had the right to judge. Certainty that no one would question her. Alora lifted her gaze to meet her father's. She pushed the envelope back across the desk. Robert Benton studied her for a long moment. Then something shifted in his expression. Something close to pride. He picked up the envelope, tore it in half, and dropped it into the trash. Good, he said simply. AGA Airlines wasn't done fighting. Just hours before the interview, the airline released a statement of their own. It wasn't an apology, it was an attack. The post went live on their website and was immediately picked up by news outlets. We take all concerns of passenger experience seriously. However, after reviewing additional security footage, we believe it is important to provide context to this situation. They attached a grainy security video from the airport lounge. It showed Alora speaking to a flight attendant, but with no audio. The clip was deliberately edited, cutting from one moment to another, piecing together a narrative that wasn't there. The message was clear. They wanted people to doubt her. They wanted to plant the idea that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't been so innocent in all of this. The internet exploded. Some people saw right through it. Classic corporate move, manipulate the footage, and hope the public eats it up. Where's the sound? Where's the full video? But others latched onto it immediately. See? She was being aggressive. This wasn't discrimination. It was a misunderstanding. Another rich kid playing the victim. Alora scrolled through the comments, feeling the air in her lungs grow heavier. This wasn't just a lawsuit anymore. It was a war of perception. And the worst part? A GA knew exactly what they were doing. The green room at ABC News was quiet, except for the hum of cameras being prepped just beyond the studio doors. Alora sat in front of the mirror, staring at her own reflection. She didn't look nervous. She looked ready. Her father stood behind her, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve. "They're going to come at you hard," he said. "They'll try to twist your words, try to make you the villain." "I know. You can still walk away," he said, though they both knew she wouldn't. She met his gaze in the mirror. "Would you?" A rare smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Never." A knock at the door. "Miss Benton," a producer called. "We're ready for you." She took a slow breath. Then she stood, smoothed her jacket, and walked to the door. As she stepped into the bright studio lights, the cameras flicked on, capturing her in perfect clarity. There was no turning back now. The bright studio lights cast a warm glow over the set of ABC News Tonight, where millions of viewers sat glued to their screens. The anticipation was electric. For the past 48 hours, the nation had debated, speculated, and argued over the events surrounding Alora Benton. Now she would speak for herself. Across from her sat Diane Morgan, a seasoned journalist with a reputation for tough but fair questioning. She had interviewed politicians, CEOs, and celebrities. But tonight, she wasn't just talking to an individual. She was speaking to the center of a movement. The countdown clock in the studio hit 0. The cameras went live. Diane folded her hands on the desk. "Miss Benton," she began, her voice smooth, professional. "There are people who say that what happened to you on Flight 1486 was an unfortunate misunderstanding. A customer service issue, nothing more. What do you say to them?" Alora met her gaze, steady and unshaken. "I say they're asking the wrong question," she replied. Diane raised an eyebrow. "And what's the right question?" Alora didn't hesitate. "If I had been a blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl in that first-class seat, would anyone have asked to see my ticket twice?" The studio went silent. Somewhere across the country, thousands of living rooms did too. Diane leaned forward slightly. "Are you saying this was an act of discrimination?" Alora exhaled. "I'm saying I was removed from my seat," she said. "I was questioned, not because of anything I did, but because of who they assumed I was." She let that hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "I didn't yell. I didn't cause a scene. I simply sat in the seat I paid for. But that wasn't enough, because for some people, no matter how well you dress, how polite you are, or how much money you have, it will never be enough." Diane studied her, taking in the words. "And yet," she said carefully, "AGA Airlines has released edited footage, implying that you were difficult with staff, that you were the one escalating the situation." Alora tilted her head slightly, a knowing smile forming. "Of course they did," she said. "That's what corporations do when they're caught. They don't apologize, they deflect." Diane didn't interrupt. "I've spent the past 2 days listening to people argue about whether or not I was polite enough when I was being disrespected. Think about that." Alora gestured lightly. "People are less upset about what happened and more focused on whether I handled it in a way that made them comfortable." The camera zoomed in slightly, capturing the fire behind her words. "But let's say, for argument's sake, that I was rude. Let's say I rolled my eyes or sighed too loudly. Would that have justified being escorted out of my seat? Would that have justified being humiliated in front of an entire cabin?" Diane didn't answer. She didn't have to, because the audience already knew. AGA Airlines executives were watching in real time. The boardroom was silent, except for the glow of the television screen, where Alora's words cut deeper than any legal filing ever could. Mark Peterson, the airline's CEO, sat stiffly in his chair, jaw clenched. "This is bad," one of the PR reps muttered. "No kidding," another said. Mark exhaled sharply. "What's the social media response?" A younger analyst glanced up from her laptop. "Not good." She clicked a few keys, pulling up trending data. "The company's sentiment rating has dropped 37% in the past hour alone." Mark ran a hand down his face. "We need to release another statement. Something stronger." Before he could finish, a voice cut through the room. "Sir." Everyone turned to the intern standing near the doorway, his face pale. "We have a bigger problem." He held up his phone. The screen displayed a breaking news alert. Back in the studio, Diane Morgan pressed her earpiece as a producer signaled something off camera. Then she turned back to Alora. "We've just received new information," she said, her voice shifting into breaking news mode. "A former AGA Airlines employee has come forward with allegations that the company has a history of covering up complaints against staff, including one against the flight attendant in question, Sharon Whitmore." The energy in the room shifted. Even Alora, who had prepared for everything, hadn't expected this. Diane continued reading from the teleprompter. "A former AGA employee who wishes to remain anonymous has stated that multiple complaints had been filed against Whitmore for inappropriate behavior toward passengers, but were dismissed by the company to avoid controversy." The air in the studio felt charged. Alora sat back in her chair. So this was why AGA was scrambling. They hadn't just mishandled her situation. They had been covering up discrimination for years. Thousands of miles away, Sharon Whitmore sat frozen in her apartment, gripping the remote as the news played out before her. She barely had time to process what was happening before her phone rang. Her stomach twisted as she saw the caller ID, a GA Airlines legal team. She let it ring twice before finally picking up. A clipped voice came through the receiver. "Sharon, we need you to make a statement." Sharon swallowed hard. "What kind of statement?" There was a pause, then, "The kind that takes responsibility for everything. The company is moving forward, and you won't be part of that process." Her blood ran cold. They were cutting her loose, throwing her under the bus. "No," she whispered. You told me this would blow over. You told me—" "The situation has changed." Sharon gripped the phone tighter. "This isn't fair. We'll offer a severance package," the lawyer said, voice mechanical. "But the official stance is that your actions were not representative of the company." Sharon's throat went dry. They weren't just firing her. They were making her the villain. Her mind raced. If she went along with this, her career was over. But if she fought back, she needed time. "I need to think," she said quickly. "There's nothing to think about, Sharon. The decision has been made." The line went dead. Sharon slowly lowered the phone, her pulse hammering in her ears. AGA thought she would take the fall without a fight, but they had just made a mistake, because Sharon wasn't going down alone. The morning after the ABC News interview, the world had changed, at least for AGA Airlines. Their stock had plummeted overnight. Protesters had gathered outside their corporate offices. Every major media outlet was running Alora Benton's words on repeat. And behind closed doors, Mark Peterson, the CEO, was facing a firing squad of his own. The AGA boardroom was filled with tension so thick it could crush steel. 12 board members sat around the long mahogany table, their eyes locked on Peterson. Some were furious, others simply exhausted by the chaos. "This is a disaster," one of them finally spoke, tossing a printed-out headline onto the table. "AGA Airlines faces federal lawsuit following racial discrimination scandal." Mark clenched his jaw. "It's not a lawsuit yet." "Yet," another board member scoffed. "We're one court filing away from a multi-million-dollar legal battle. Our investors are demanding answers. Our customers are demanding accountability. And you let this situation spiral completely out of control." Mark exhaled sharply. "We're handling it." "No, you're not," someone cut him off. "Because while you've been flailing, Sharon Whitmore is out there making things worse." He stiffened. "What do you mean?" A woman at the far end of the table turned up the volume on the conference room TV. On screen, Sharon Whitmore sat in the studio of a competing network, tears streaming down her face. "I never meant to hurt anyone," she sobbed, gripping a tissue. "This has been the hardest time of my life. My entire career, everything I've worked for, has been destroyed because of a misunderstanding." The host leaned in sympathetically. "So you feel you were unfairly treated in this situation?" Sharon nodded, her voice trembling. "I was just doing my job. But now I'm being treated like a monster. I've received threats. My family is terrified, all because of one mistake." Mark Peterson gritted his teeth. He should have seen this coming. Sharon wasn't going to go down quietly. She was flipping the script. And worse, some people were actually buying it. Alora sat in her father's office, watching the interview in silence. Her father and his legal team stood around her, waiting for her reaction. But she didn't flinch, because she had expected this exact move. Robert Benton folded his arms. She's trying to control the narrative. A lawyer leaned forward. Our public support is still stronger. But this complicates things. Some people are now seeing her as a victim. If we push too hard, it could backfire. Alora took a deep breath. She had never wanted this to be personal. She wasn't here for revenge. She was here for justice. But people like Sharon always played the victim when consequences came knocking. She could ignore it, or she could fight back. Her father cleared his throat. The legal team has gone over our options. A stack of documents was placed in front of her. If we move forward, we're taking this to federal court. This won't just be about one flight. It will set a legal precedent about racial discrimination in airlines. Alora ran her fingers over the papers. This will get ugly, a lawyer warned. You will be dragged through the mud. The press will go after your past, your family. The right-wing media will tear you apart. Her father sat down across from her. You don't have to do this. I can still handle it quietly. Alora looked at him. Then she looked at the legal complaint in front of her. This wasn't just about her anymore. If she walked away, AGA Airlines would write a check and move on. But if she fought, if she won, it wouldn't just be her victory. It would be for every person who had been told they didn't belong. She picked up a pen and signed. I'm not backing down, she said. Not now, not ever. Her father smiled, just slightly. The lawyer took the signed document. Then it's official. Alora exhaled slowly. The fight was no longer just headlines. It was a legal war. At AGA Airlines headquarters, Mark Peterson was handed the court summons. The airline was being sued for racial discrimination. His stomach sank. They weren't just facing a lawsuit. They were facing a federal investigation. Everything had changed, and they were running out of moves. Across town, Sharon Whitmore's phone rang. It was AGA's legal team. She hesitated before picking up. Hello, a cold voice responded. You're on your own now. Sharon felt her blood run cold. They were cutting her loose, but she wasn't going down alone. She was going to fight back, and this time, she was playing for herself. 4 months had passed since the incident on Flight 1486, but the firestorm it ignited had not died down. If anything, it had only intensified. On the morning of the first hearing, the steps of the federal courthouse for the Southern District of New York were flooded with reporters, activists, and legal analysts eager to witness the start of what was already being called one of the most significant discrimination lawsuits in aviation history. Alora Benton stepped out of a black SUV, flanked by her legal team. Dressed in a crisp navy suit, she carried herself with the kind of quiet confidence that made cameras click nonstop. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. On one side sat AGA Airlines' army of lawyers, their expressions carefully neutral, their briefcases filled with strategies designed to discredit Alora. And at the front of the defense table sat Sharon Whitmore. Sharon had aged in the past 4 months. The stress had hollowed out her features, and the once proud flight attendant now sat rigid, knowing she was about to become the first witness called to the stand. The judge called the court to order. The prosecution's lead attorney, Olivia Carter, rose from her seat. A powerhouse in the legal world, Olivia was known for her razor-sharp cross-examinations and her unwavering stance against corporate injustice. She approached the podium, voice measured but firm. Your Honor, today we begin a case that goes beyond one individual, Olivia said. This is about a system that allowed discrimination to exist unchecked, that protected those who upheld it, and that, even when caught, attempted to buy its way out of accountability. She turned toward Sharon Whitmore. Our first witness, Your Honor, is Sharon Whitmore, the flight attendant who removed Miss Benton from her seat that day. The courtroom doors opened, and Sharon was led to the stand. She took a deep breath as she was sworn in, avoiding Alora's gaze as she sat down. AGA's defense lawyer, Philip Grant, approached first. His questions were carefully crafted to paint Sharon as a dutiful employee, simply following corporate protocol. Miss Whitmore, did you personally make the decision to remove Miss Benton from first class? Sharon swallowed, then nodded. Yes. And did you believe at the time that you were acting within the airline's procedures? Another nod. Yes, I did. Philip smiled slightly, turning to the jury. So to clarify, you were not acting out of personal bias, but rather adhering to what you believed was company policy? Yes. Philip clasped his hands together as if presenting an open and shut case. No further questions. He stepped back, looking satisfied. But then Olivia Carter stood, and the energy in the room shifted. She walked slowly towards Sharon, flipping open a file. Miss Whitmore, she began, you just stated that you acted within company policy. Are you absolutely sure about that? Sharon hesitated. Yes. Olivia nodded as if considering her answer. Then she pulled out a printed document. This is an internal AGA Airlines report, Olivia said, holding it up for the jury to see. It was filed 2 years ago by a black passenger who claimed you targeted them unfairly on a flight from Chicago to Miami. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Sharon's face went pale. Olivia wasn't done. There's more, she continued, flipping the page. A second complaint, 3 months later, and a third one just last year. Different passengers. Same pattern. She took a step closer. AGA Airlines never disciplined you for these incidents. Instead, they buried the reports because admitting to a pattern of discrimination would have been bad for business. Sharon's fingers tightened on the edge of the witness stand. Philip Grant stood quickly. Objection. Relevance? The judge raised a hand. Overruled. Continue. Sharon's breathing grew unsteady. Miss Whitmore, Olivia said, voice unwavering, this isn't just about Alora Benton anymore, is it? This is about a history of racial discrimination that was covered up. A history that you played a role in. Sharon's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Because what could she say? Just when the courtroom thought it had seen the biggest bombshell of the day, another wave hit. A clerk rushed into the room, handing a note to Olivia Carter. She scanned it, then smiled. Your Honor, she said, turning to the judge, I'd like to enter a new piece of evidence into the record. She walked over to the bailiff, handing him a USB drive. The judge nodded. Proceed. The courtroom screen lit up, and then a voice played over the speakers. A recording. The room fell dead silent as a deep male voice spoke. If we throw her a big enough check, she'll take it. That's what they always do. A second voice laughed. Exactly. Let's just buy her off. A lawsuit is bad for us, but a settlement? That's just business. The voices belonged to AGA executives. Sharon's eyes widened. Mark Peterson, sitting in the back of the room, visibly stiffened. Someone in AGA's own leadership had been recorded planning to silence Alora. And now the world was hearing it. The judge's expression darkened. This is highly concerning, he said. I am ordering a full inquiry into these allegations. A ripple of shock spread across the courtroom. AGA Airlines was no longer just fighting a discrimination lawsuit. Now they were facing a federal investigation. Mark Peterson could feel his empire crumbling. He turned to one of his lawyers. What do we do? He whispered. The lawyer hesitated, then leaned in. We make her an offer, a bigger one. Mark's mind raced. It was their only option now. A few moments later, a manila envelope was slid across the table toward Alora's legal team. Philip Grant stood up. The defense, he announced, would like to propose a settlement. The judge glanced at Olivia. Counselor? Olivia looked at Alora. This was it. They were offering millions. Enough to end the fight right now? If she accepted, she could walk away with more money than most people would see in a lifetime. But if she refused, she could take them all the way. Alora Benton stared at the envelope. She took a breath. Then she lifted her head and made her decision. The conference room inside Benton Holdings was silent, except for the soft rustling of papers as Robert Benton flipped through the settlement offer. $50 million. AGA Airlines was desperate. They had seen the way the case was turning against them, how the federal investigation into their hiring and discrimination practices had rattled investors. Their only hope now was to make Alora go away before things got worse. Robert leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. They're offering a clean exit, he said, placing the documents on the table. No admissions of wrongdoing, no further legal battles, Just a settlement and a signed NDA. He glanced at Alora, his expression unreadable. If you take this, it all ends here. Across the table, Olivia Carter, Alora's lead attorney, tapped her nails against the polished wood. This is a calculated move, she said. They know they can't win in court, but they also know that continuing the fight will put you under even more scrutiny. If you take the money, you walk away without further attacks. If you refuse, she let the weight of that possibility hang in the air. Alora knew what she meant. If she refused, they would come for her. She had already seen the signs, the hate emails, the online smear campaigns. The right-wing media had turned her into the villain of their narrative. They called her a spoiled brat, a privileged princess, a fraud who was weaponizing race for personal gain. On talk radio, conservative hosts sneered at her, calling her a threat to American businesses. She had even received death threats. People wanted her to back down, to take the money, to move on, to stop making noise. And for a split second, she considered it. $50 million meant freedom. She could disappear, buy a house somewhere quiet, leave all of this behind. She wouldn't have to wake up every morning and check her email, wondering if another news outlet had written a hit piece about her. She could just live. But then she thought of the thousands, millions of people who didn't have that option. The ones who had lost jobs because of discrimination, the ones who had been denied opportunities before they even got a chance to prove themselves, the ones who had been silenced before anyone ever listened. If she took this money, she would be just another person who let them win. She looked at her father. For years, she had fought against the privilege of being his daughter. She had wanted to make her own name, not be defined by his. But now she understood that power only mattered if you used it for something bigger than yourself. Without hesitation, Alora reached for the settlement documents. Then she tore them in half. The sound of paper ripping was deafening in the quiet room. Olivia raised an eyebrow while Robert Benton let out a small, almost imperceptible chuckle. His daughter had just declared war. AGA Airlines received their answer within the hour. The moment the rejection was confirmed, Mark Peterson slammed his phone onto his desk, his face twisted in frustration. "She's out of her damn mind," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. The legal team sat across from him, shifting uncomfortably. "She's not backing down," one of the lawyers said. "And with the federal investigation gaining traction, we have bigger problems now. If we don't settle, we could—" Peterson slammed his fist on the table. "We're not losing this company to some 20-year-old kid," he growled. "Find another way to discredit her. Find anything." That evening, Alora stood in front of a packed press room, cameras flashing in rapid succession. She had spent the past few months speaking carefully, choosing her words with precision, but not today. Today, she would say exactly what needed to be said. She took the podium, her voice steady, her presence commanding. "I was offered $50 million today," she began. $50 million to stay quiet, to let this all go. The room hushed. Alora scanned the faces in front of her, reporters, activists, critics, before she continued. "AGA Airlines thinks this is about money," she said. "They think they can make this problem disappear the way they've done before. But this isn't about a paycheck." She exhaled, letting the weight of her words settle. "This is about power, about who gets to be treated with dignity and who doesn't." She paused. Then she delivered the final blow. "And I want to make one thing clear. I am not for sale." The press room exploded. Reporters scrambled to ask questions. Cameras flashed wildly, capturing the exact moment AGA Airlines lost control of the narrative. Because now, it wasn't just a lawsuit, it was a movement, and Alora Benton was leading it. The courtroom was silent as the final day of the trial began. The weight of the past months hung heavy in the air. The once untouchable AGA Airlines was now fighting for its survival, its secrets laid bare for the world to see. As Alora Benton entered the courtroom, she could feel the shift. The power dynamic was no longer the same. AGA had spent months trying to silence her. Now they were the ones begging to be heard. The prosecution had demanded the release of internal emails from AGA Airlines, and the results were damning. Displayed on a large screen before the entire court, the documents told a story of systemic discrimination, buried complaints, and a corporate culture built on exclusion. One email from an executive in customer relations read, We need to be more selective about who gets premium seating. Our most valuable clients expect a certain type of experience. Another message from a high-ranking manager outright admitted, "We've received multiple complaints from crew members about uncomfortable first-class passengers. If we quietly reassign them, we avoid the PR headache." The worst one, however, was from Mark Peterson himself. "These things blow over. Throw them a settlement, make them sign an NDA, and move on." The room erupted in whispers. AGA Airlines had spent years covering up the same behavior they had denied existed. They hadn't just ignored discrimination, they had protected it. Outside the courthouse, the world reacted in real time. Social media exploded as news networks broadcast the leaked emails. Boycott AGA skyrocketed to the top of Twitter trends. Stock prices plummeted by 30% in a single morning. Airline unions announced internal votes of no confidence in leadership. Even loyal customers, some of whom had flown with AGA for decades, cut ties overnight. And the biggest blow? AGA's largest shareholders, including investment firms that controlled billions, began pulling their money. They weren't just dealing with bad press anymore. They were facing financial collapse. In the center of it all was Sharon Whitmore. She sat at the witness stand, her once impeccable uniform replaced with a simple blazer. The confident woman who had ordered Alora out of her seat was now a shell of herself. She had lost everything, her job, her reputation, her future. And yet, as she stared at the overwhelming evidence against her and AGA Airlines, she still tried to fight. "I was following protocol," she said, voice shaking. Olivia Carter, Alora's attorney, didn't let up. "Was it protocol to ignore company policies and remove a passenger without cause?" Sharon hesitated. I I was acting on my best judgment." Olivia stepped closer. "And what was your judgment based on?" Sharon's hands gripped the edge of the witness stand. I, She looked at Alora. For months she had hated this girl. She had blamed her for ruining her career, for making her the villain. But now as she sat under the bright courtroom lights, she saw herself clearly. She saw who she had been, who she had chosen to be. The words came out barely above a whisper. "I judged her because of how she looked," Sharon admitted. The room was so silent you could hear a pin drop. "I assumed she didn't belong, and I acted on that assumption." A murmur spread through the courtroom. It wasn't an apology, but it was a confession, a truth that could no longer be denied. Mark Peterson sat at the defense table, jaw clenched. He knew the verdict was coming, but the damage was already done. AGA Airlines wasn't just going to lose this case. They were going to lose everything. The judge finally called for order and prepared to read the ruling. In light of the overwhelming evidence, this court finds that AGA Airlines engaged in systemic racial discrimination and failed to address internal complaints in a responsible manner. He turned toward the defense. As a result, AGA Airlines is ordered to pay damages in excess of $200 million. Furthermore, the airline is required to implement a full restructuring of its hiring, training, and internal complaint policies under federal oversight. Gasps rippled through the crowd. It was a landmark ruling. AGA had lost. As the courtroom emptied, reporters swarmed Alora, shouting questions. "How do you feel about today's verdict? What's next for you? Will you continue fighting for civil rights?" She paused, looking around. For so long, this had been about proving a point. Now the point had been made. She had stood against one of the biggest corporations in the country and won. But this wasn't just about a verdict. This was about change, and she wasn't done yet. Alora looked into the cameras and smiled. This is just the beginning. The fallout from the verdict was swift and unforgiving. AGA Airlines, once a dominant force in the aviation industry, was now in free fall. Their stock continued to plummet, dropping another 40% in the days following the trial. Investors scrambled to cut their losses. The board of directors, desperate to salvage what was left, forced Mark Peterson to resign in disgrace. But it wasn't just Peterson who fell. Several high-ranking executives were ousted, and the company was forced into emergency restructuring. New regulations were imposed on their hiring and training processes. Their competitors, watching the destruction unfold, began quietly reevaluating their own policies. None of them wanted to be the next AGA Airlines. The message was clear. This wasn't just a lawsuit, this was a warning. For Sharon Whitmore, the consequences were inescapable. The airline had terminated her officially, citing violations of ethical conduct. But that was just the beginning. With her name now tied to one of the biggest discrimination cases in corporate history, no airline would hire her. Her career in aviation was over. She tried applying for jobs outside the industry, but every Google search of her name led back to this scandal. Her face was plastered across news articles, opinion pieces, and social media threads, labeled as a symbol of everything wrong with corporate bias. She wasn't just being criticized by Alora's supporters, she was being abandoned by her own side. Former colleagues distanced themselves from her. Even those who had once agreed with her privately now acted as if they had never met her. One afternoon, as she left a grocery store, a journalist spotted her. "Miss Whitmore?" he called out, microphone in hand. She kept walking, pretending not to hear. "Do you have any regrets?" he asked, his voice following her. Sharon hesitated for just a moment. Then, without answering, she stepped into her car, shut the door, and drove away. Because she wasn't sure if she had an excuse anymore. Alora Benton had changed. She could feel it. She wasn't just some 17-year-old girl who had gotten mistreated on a flight anymore. She was a symbol now. Her name was on the front page of every major newspaper. News anchors debated her every decision. Some called her a hero. Others called her a spoiled troublemaker who had ruined a great American company. She had gone from anonymous to unavoidable, and with that fame came a price. Her email inbox was filled with messages, some from people thanking her, others from people hating her. Threats poured in daily. Anonymous accounts told her she had destroyed hard-working Americans' jobs. Others said they wished she had just stayed quiet and taken the money. She wondered if this fight had cost her too much. Her father, Robert Benton, stood beside her on the balcony of their Manhattan penthouse, watching the city lights flicker below. "You don't have to keep doing this," he said quietly. Elora didn't respond right away. He continued, "You've won. They lost. You could step away from all of this. Go back to your life. No one would blame you." She turned to him, searching his face. "Would you?" she asked. Robert smiled slightly. "Number. But I'm not 17. Alora looked back at the city. She had never asked for this spotlight. She had never wanted to be famous. But this wasn't just about her anymore. She thought about the millions of people who had followed this case, the ones who had seen themselves in her fight. If she walked away now, what would that say to them? That justice was only for those who could afford it. That silence was still the safest choice? She had one more move to make. The next morning, Alora called a press conference. Cameras flashed wildly as she stepped up to the podium, dressed in simple but elegant attire, her presence commanding the room. She cleared her throat, steady and sure. "I want to thank everyone who has supported me through this fight," she began. "This case was never just about me. It was about fairness. It was about accountability. And most of all, it was about change." She let the weight of her words settle before continuing. "The court has ruled in my favor, and AGA Airlines has been held accountable. But the reality is, AGA was never the only one," the journalist murmured. "There are thousands of cases just like mine that never make it to the front page. Cases where people without power, without resources, are forced to stay silent because they don't have another choice." She took a breath, then delivered the moment that would shock the world. "That is why I am announcing the creation of a new independent watchdog organization, one dedicated to monitoring and holding the entire service industry accountable for discrimination." The room exploded in reaction. "Every dollar of the settlement I receive from AGA Airlines will go into funding this effort. This isn't just about one airline anymore. This is about ensuring this never happens again." The impact of her words was immediate. Headlines flooded social media. Alora Benton turns lawsuit victory into civil rights movement. AGA Airlines loses, but the fight is just beginning. She had refused to be bought off. She had refused to be silenced. And now she was taking her fight beyond a courtroom. As the reporters shouted questions, Alora smiled in daze, because she had made her choice. And she wasn't done yet.